Alright students, the purpose of this video is to go over cell transport. I'm going to go over the 5 types of cell transport. I'm going to go over diffusion, an example of diffusion, and I'm also going to briefly talk about homeostasis in this video. So this is the first time I'm using this pen, so hopefully I know how to use it. So excuse the mistakes, but hopefully I'll get better at this. So there are 5 ways that cells transport materials, and we're talking about materials. We're talking about water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, ions, proteins, all these different substances that the cells move in and out. When we're talking about this, we're referring to cell transport. So let me go over the 5 of them right now. So the 5 that you are responsible to understand are diffusion, facilitated diffusion, active transport, and exocytosis and endocytosis. So I'm going to go over those in this presentation. Before we understand the 5 ways of transport, we have to understand the concept, the scientific concept of diffusion. So I'm going to go over that right now. So this is a drawing, a diagram of an area of high concentration and an area of low concentration. So let me write the definition the best I can of diffusion. Diffusion is the movement. Remember, we're talking about transport, so we're talking about movement. The movement of molecules from an area of high concentration, well, you can barely see that, to an area of low concentration. All right, so I underlined the important words. So when we're talking about diffusion, we're referring to molecules. So molecules, as you've learned previously, are made up of atoms, and molecules are very important for biological organisms because we need those molecules to survive. An example of molecules would be oxygen molecules. So we're going to pretend that these little circles represent oxygen molecules. An area of high concentration. Well, so what does that mean? We're talking about high concentration. Concentration refers to how the molecules are bunched up, how together they are. If they are highly concentrated, that means that the molecules, in this case, are really close to each other. They're concentrated into one tight area. And you can tell right here, all of these oxygen molecules, these circles, are highly concentrated. They're very close to each other. If we have low concentration, that means the molecules are more spread out, and there's also less of them. So low concentration, the molecules are spread out, not a lot of them. High concentration, they're very close to each other, and there is a lot of them. So what this means is that the molecules are going to move in the direction of high concentration to low concentration. So I'll put an arrow right there. You can't see that, but the molecules are going to move into this direction. And students always ask me, why do they move in that direction? So if you remember from previous classes, in your science classes, you learn about molecules that are constantly in motion. They're vibrating, they're bouncing up and down, they're bouncing off each other. That's just something, that's a reality. That's what happens. So eventually these molecules, they move into areas where they're not highly present. So an example would be, which I don't like when it happens, and I always tell students to don't do this. So you have a student, I'll draw stick figures, happy freshman. and they just came back from PE, and they decide to spray themselves with Axe because they didn't take a shower. Most students don't take showers after PE. So what happens is that they spray the Axe all over them, and the Axe is represented by these Axe molecules. And because of diffusion, the molecules are going to move to the other side of the room until they're evenly spread out. And then you have Mr. Acosta angry because he doesn't like smelling cologne and Axe in the room. I tell them, do it after. So why does this happen? Well, because of wonderful diffusion. Highly concentrated here, low concentrated here, and the molecules are going to move from high to low. This also happens when you get, let's say, look at this wonderful art right here. Let's say you drink coffee or something, and the coffee is black, and you put the cream in there, and the cream is going to be highly concentrated, and it's going to eventually move to the rest of the coffee, and then your coffee is nicely colored. And it looks kind of cool, like you've seen it. You drop creamer in it, and then the cream spreads out. Well, that is because of the process of diffusion. So diffusion refers to molecules, and they move in the air, and they move through liquid, air and liquid. So diffusion is really important. Just high concentrated to low concentration, and this is a type of transport. Now, why does this matter? Why do we care? Well, many molecules get into the cell through diffusion, diffusion and facilitated diffusion. So that's what you need to understand this before we go on to the next section. Okay, so cell transport. We have our structure right here. This is called what is that called? Cell membrane. It's also called plasma membrane. The plasma membrane, the cell membrane, is the structure that is responsible, and its function is to transport materials in and out of the cell. It's a very important structure. All cells have them, and it's what controls, what regulates what goes in and what goes out. So you need to understand that before we go over that. So we have our phospholipids right here, and then we have our proteins, and these proteins are also very important for cell transport. So let's go over diffusion. So really quick, this is the inside of the cell, inside or internal environment. And then obviously we have external. So outside of the cell, inside of the cell. Outside, inside. So the first type of transport is diffusion. So basically all what it is outside we have high concentration of molecules. Inside we have low concentration. So like we said before, the molecules are going to move from area of high concentration to low concentration, and the molecules move from outside of the cell into inside of the cell. Examples of this would be like oxygen. You breathe oxygen. That oxygen is outside of the cell, and your cells need oxygen, but there's very low, so the oxygen is going to go into the cell. And this happens in red blood cells. You breathe in, the oxygen moves from from high to low, and then the oxygen gets into the red blood cells. Facilitated diffusion is when the same thing happens from high concentration to low concentration, but the molecules can't go directly through the phospholipid bilayer, so they have to go through a protein. it's too much detail, but they're called channel proteins, transport proteins. They are proteins that are on the surface of the cell, and they're like little tunnels where the substances go in through, and then the molecules go into the cell. The reason it's called facilitated diffusion, facile refers to, easy. The cell's proteins make it easy for the substances to diffuse into the cell. So protein diffusion, facilitate diffusion. No protein just goes through, regular diffusion. Now, they are defined, both of these types of transport, they're defined as passive transport. Now, why they're referred as passive transport is because the cell does not have to use energy in order to have this process happen. It just happens because of the molecular motion. The cell itself does not use energy to have this process occur. So passive, no energy required by the cell. No ATP, which is an energy molecule. That's why it's called passive. Think of it like a person that, a person that's considered passive, they really don't do much, kind of quiet, not very energetic. Well, that's why scientists have named it passive transport. Now let's go to active transport. I think if you understand why passive, active does require energy. ATP is needed. So in active transport, the cell has to use energy in order to move things into itself. So if you see right here, this is low concentration and this is high concentration. The cell is pumping things from outside of itself into itself. Going against diffusion involves a form of energy. This just happens. In order to go against the concentration rule of diffusion, the cell actually has to transport it. And pumps, like water pumps, require a form of energy. And the cell also requires a form of energy to move things into itself. This happens in nerve cells. Nerve cells have to actively pump sodium, potassium out of itself against the concentrations gradients. So the common example would be pumps. Pumps that exist on the cell membrane use energy. These are the three ways of transport, but there is two more, and let me go over it. I think this video is going to be too long, but you can watch it in parts. Okay, there is another way that cells get things in and get things out. So those two processes are called exocytosis and endocytosis. And I wrote this in the notes, but exo, or root, I know a lot of you like roots. Exit, outside, like exoskeleton. And then we have endo, inside. And cyto refers to cell, and cis just refers, or is, it's a process. See how wonderful roots are? So endocytosis is how the cell is a process where the cell takes things into itself. Exocytosis is when the cell um, releases or exits something out of itself. These two processes are also a form of active transport. Active transport uses energy. This is a energy. It needs energy to occur. So let me go over exocytosis. So again, it's kind of hard to see, but this is out of the cell. This is outside. Oops. How do I do that? I messed up, but let me erase that. Oops, I'm deleting the picture. Huh. See, this is why fancy YouTubers have editors. I don't have an editor. So again, this is outside, and this is inside of the cell. So basically, without going into much detail, what the cell does is that it produces some sort of material. It could produce proteins, hormones, and it wraps the material inside of a membrane. There's internal membranes. It wraps the material inside of that to form these structures called, if I can write on it, vesicles. So these vesicles have the material inside, and they are wrapped in a cell membrane. And what they do is that they go outside of the cell and they fuse with the membrane, and the material gets released outside of the cell. This has mostly happened. This happens in like pancreatic cells. Pancreas produces insulin, and the insulin has to be released out to the bloodstream. This also happens in nerve cells, neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine. Trying to think of other ones from the top of my head. Serotonin, dopamine, those are neurotransmitters that neurons produce, and they are released into the synapse, and then they go to other cells to transmit signals. That is exocytosis. Exits out of the cell. And it uses energy, and it uses a membrane. Endocytosis is when things go into the cell. Something goes through the membrane, it gets wrapped up into the membrane, and then it fuses with the cell membrane, and it goes right in. What types of cells do this? Well, the common example would be like a immunity cell, a macrophage, a white blood cell. When they eat bacteria, they wrap themselves over the bacteria, and then it takes in the bacteria, and it uses lysosomes to digest it, and it breaks it apart, and that what keeps you healthy. So this is more like white blood cells do this. Can I spell white blood cells? This is more like neurons, pancreatic cells. Other cells do this, but this is just from the top of my head. So again, an easy way to remember: endo, inside; exo, outside. And they both require energy, and they're a form of active transport, and these are cells that do that. Okay, so that's what cell transport is. Why does it matter? Why do we care? Why do we care? Well, this is how the cell maintains homeostasis. It maintains an internal stable environment, and things have to be constantly moving in and out of the cell all the time. Your cells are doing this right now. They're doing it so the cell can be nice and happy and functioning properly. So hopefully, I think this video was too long, but you can watch it in parts. So what was the purpose of this video? Purpose of this video was to go over cell transport, the 5 ways. understand what diffusion is, and also briefly talk about why it's important because it has to do with, oops, no, I'm messing up at the last minute. It has to do with homeostasis. All right, that's it. We'll continue this in class.